Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers. Later, U.S. Senator Rand Paul is with us. He'll talk about issues facing our country as he runs for re-election. We'll get his take on the presidential race and find out what he's working on in Washington. Senator Rand Paul later. But first, Lexington Police Chief Mark Barnard is here. The horrific shooting rampage that left 49 people and the killer dead in Orlando has law enforcement scrambling around the country. The attack at the Pulse nightclub came as the LGBTQ community around the country observes Pride Month. The Pride Festival in Lexington is set for next Saturday. There are other major events in this city this summer. Lexington Police Chief Mark Barnard says he has met with festival coordinators, others in the city. They've devised a plan to keep people safe. And the chief is joining us on Kentucky Newsmakers. Thank you for coming in.
Well, thank you for having me.
First of all, your thoughts about what happened last weekend in Orlando from a law enforcement standpoint. Could it have been prevented? Could the shooter have been stopped before 49 people were dead?
You know, I'm not sure of the circumstances that occurred within the club. I know that law enforcement has changed nationally the way that they attend to mass shootings. We did that basically when Columbine occurred. People don't realize Columbine, they actually knew the intel that it was going to occur, but they thought it was at a mall and it happened at the school instead. We have changed our strategies where we used to contain an incident and then go right in. So I think they did that in Orlando. They were trying to retrieve injured people from inside the building. Once the shooting had stopped and they understood that they had hostages, he started working. They worked on from that point or perspective. So I don't know. Internally, think differently. I think they'll do what we do as a case review of after this incident. I know the FBI, we meet regularly on our Joint Terrorism Task Force. We share information back and forth about strategies that are occurring or what agencies have done and how to address it. And that's basically what we're doing now with the Pride Fest. Because it's an event downtown and it's a large event that can draw up to 25,000 people. And anytime an event occurs in our nation, such as this act of terrorism, we want to make sure that we're planning and staffing to have adequate safety there. So we'll have more officers. There'll be more on the perimeter than in that inner perimeter where we usually do it. But this will occur. We've done the same thing for the 4th of July. So we've increased our staffing for it. There are no threats. We've talked to the FBI, we've talked to Intel throughout the state, the Fusion Center. As we understand it as of today, there are no threats to Lexington nor Kentucky regarding any external threats.
As you meet with the organizers of the Pride Festival and other summer events that are going on, do you ask them to share their concerns and do you give them some directives?
Absolutely. So we want them to feel comfortable with our staffing plan that we have in place and our contingency plans that we have in place. We met with the Pride Festival. We had been meeting with the LGBT community prior to the Pride Festival, so we had an open line of communication with them. And any concerns that they have, we want to make sure that we're putting them at rest, that we'll be there and support them. You know, through tragedy come great opportunities, and one of the great opportunities we've had is we have met with leadership within our Islamic community, with the LGBT community, with our Latino, Hispanic community. We have gone out to create those relationships so that we're prepared before an event like this happens. And that's very important for us. The first calls that I made that evening when these occurred were to our LGBT community leadership team, asking them if they had any concerns or if something was coming up to please let us know, open those line of communications, and also to our Islamic leadership in Lexington. And they have been very receptive about giving us information or sharing information or concerns that they may have.
What can people do out there to keep you informed, to keep themselves and the community safe?
Well, really, if you see something suspicious, you should report it. Nothing is too small, and that's what we always say. A lot of times people are uncomfortable coming to the police. One, they don't want to bother us. They say, oh, it's not important. Or two, they just don't feel comfortable coming to the police. That's why these leadership teams that we have in Lexington, that we have this intimate relationship that we can speak to honestly and keep information confidential. If they want to approach them and give them information, they're able to give it to us.
Do you, in this case with having your force, deployed for these major scale events, do at times you become strained, for instance, when the 4th of July is coming up and now the decision has had to be made that there will be the parade and the festival and other events downtown, and then fireworks will be that evening out at Commonwealth Stadium.
We are very well at adapting to whatever is thrown to us because we're in an urban city, so we have to be adaptable. So whatever the plan is, once we get it, then that's when we start working up our contingency and safety plans. It is a little bit more challenging having it downtown and then moving it out to the Arboretum, but we've worked with UKPD. They'll have officers present. We've worked with the Sheriff's Department. We have great relationships with our other law enforcement agencies. We constantly share information with our foreign intel experts in the FBI and the ATF, so in the Secret Service. So we constantly meet and we evaluate conditions and make arrangements accordingly.
The new budget has some additional officers in it for the coming year.
Absolutely. We'll go up to 600 officers. We're blessed that the council looked at that and sees the need for public safety. Getting up to those officers, we're recruiting. We're hiring right now. That'll go to August. If you're interested in becoming an officer, you can still go through the testing process. We hope to have that class out by February. We hope to start another class of maybe 25 in August, so constantly hiring.
We have looked ahead to next week's council agenda. There's $300,000 in there for smart tasers. What's that for?
Well, that's the newer technology. So taser, like any technology, looks at its product and says we want to make improvements, and so more recording, more being able to discern the information when tasers are deployed. The current tasers that we have were the first generation that we purchased, and they're no longer making replacement parts for them. So it's time to move on to the technology and replace those.
Other crime trends that you're watching this summer?
Well, I will tell you, and you and I seem like every time we're here we're discussing it, the shootings are a little bit alarming to me because it's like the country is divisive, and so are the community and the segment of our community that are shooting each other. When you have two people come in to purchase heroin in a parking lot in Walmart and then they have a shootout over it, over the ripoff, that seems to be going on consistently. So the heroin epidemic, and I really call it the addiction epidemic because it'll be replaced, heroin will soon when we get the legislature to come in and do more legislation and criminalizing it further. It'll come in and fill the void with something else. So we have to work on the addiction issues. We have to work on the gun violence. I'm hoping the legislature will look at the gun violence and say if you're using a gun illegally, making enhancements for using that gun.
Do you think, and as we'll let you go and make room for Senator Rand Paul, who's coming in next and start to talk more politics, but do you believe that some compromise is going to be reached on some of these gun issues, or is this with us for the foreseeable future? In terms of, you know, it's a real standoff in the country.
It really is, and I would hope everyone would put that aside and look at the people that are facing those issues right now. Our officers went into a call just the other night, and you know this, where a gentleman was holding his wife and two children hostage, fired at our officers. They had to get the wife and child out. There was another child left in the home. Knowing that this person had a weapon, had fired at them before, had to make entry because of a medical issue for the younger child and pull that child out. Our officers are facing this every day, and I would hope the politicians will be able to look at it and say, and look at the victims of the gun violence and find some common ground to say people that use firearms illegally should be punished, and we should take a stand on it and say enough. I mean, we don't want to punish the people who are using them legally, just the ones that are victimizing other individuals or are using them illegally. That's where we should take the stand and say enough is enough, and I hope they can find a compromise to support the victims of gun violence and support law enforcement officials and officers that are facing that on the street every day.
Chief Mark Barnard, thank you for coming. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you'll keep it here on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. Back with Senator Rand Paul next. Welcome back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. U.S. Senator Rand Paul is traveling the state as he seeks a second term in Washington. Senator Paul spent some of last year running for president while also remaining a candidate for re-election here in Kentucky. He pushed for a caucus so he could seek two offices at once in Kentucky, but then dropped out of the race for the White House before the primaries started. Since then, he has held numerous town hall meetings to talk with those he represents. It appears the Republicans are set to nominate Donald Trump, who was harshly critical of Paul in the debates. Senator Paul is a medical doctor and an ophthalmologist who has long pushed for smaller government and less federal debt. He is joining us today, and Senator Paul, we welcome you. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be with you.
Let's get to this current major and tragic issue, the shooting massacre in Orlando. 49 people were killed last weekend. There are many calls for action, including preventing people on terrorist watch lists from being able to purchase guns. Some recent numbers show that 91% of the time when people on those lists went to purchase a gun, they were able to complete the purchase. You have had reservations about that in the past. Is there a version of a proposal you would support?
You know, it's a horrific tragedy, and, you know, everybody thinks, oh my goodness, how do we stop this? How do we stop, you know, terrorists from having guns? But I'm kind of a big believer in reading the bills, you know, trying to figure out what's in them and whether it would work. As a physician, we try to look things very logically. What will work and what would have stopped this killing? So let's say you do what the Democrats want to do. They want to take away the Second Amendment rights of anybody on the terror list. Well, this killer wasn't on the list. And so I've been asking this question. I met with the FBI director. I've been asking this question over and over again. Why wasn't he on the list? And the answer I'm getting is that they investigated him a couple of times. They had an investigation over for 10 months, and then they closed it. And so my response to the FBI was, well, you said he wasn't a credible threat, and I understand you did your best, but he was a credible threat. Maybe we should leave the investigations open longer. And if there is an open investigation, you're on the list, and what happens currently is the FBI is called before you can buy a weapon. So we do have a system, but the system broke down here mainly because the FBI closed the investigation. And there's a lot of evidence why they might have should have kept it open. Several times, at least 2 or 3 times, he threatened coworkers. Even going back to 2007, he was kicked out of a police academy for threatening coworkers. Twice he said he was going to kill people and it was going to be part of an Islamic jihad. He went to Saudi Arabia. He also was in communication, if indirectly, some communication with a suicide bomber. You add all of that up and you're like, why in the world did they close the investigation? And then the news is today that I'm hearing, or in the last couple of days, he went to a gun store 5 weeks before this, tried to buy body armor and tried to buy 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and they actually called the FBI. And so I'm thinking, gosh, if I'm in the FBI, what would I do? I was like, maybe I would look in a 100-mile radius for people we've interviewed, take their pictures down to the gun store and say, which one of they didn't have his name, but I'm guessing they might have been able to catch this guy. So we've got to do a better job at trying to stop people, better police work. But it doesn't make sense. You know, a lot of people have been for gun control. National Democrats have been for more gun control and banning guns for a long time. But we have to decide would it worked. So they want to ban guns for people on the list. But the problem is the guy wasn't on the list, so it wouldn't fix the problem. What I'm doing is saying, I don't want terrorists to have guns. How would it actually fix the problem? So I am for legislation that would say we keep the FBI investigations open longer. And what we're going to put forward on Monday is that FBI investigations will be open for 5 years. If you start and you get interviewed, it's going to be open for 5 years. Doesn't mean they're looking at you the whole time, but it means you'd be on the list the whole time.
If you remain on that list, would you then be opposed to them being able to purchase a weapon?
Well, they wouldn't be able to. The FBI would be notified. Now, it doesn't mean that they're permanently prevented, though. What would have to happen is a court proceeding. And the reason we want that is that, let's say you and I work together and I'm Arab American and you don't like me and you decide to call the FBI and say that I made a threat to you at work. There's a lot of unfair threats that aren't real threats. The FBI has to work through these. The FBI has a very difficult job. So they work through these and then they remove people from the list. I wouldn't want to give up my First Amendment rights because you accused me of something or vice versa. Neither would I want to give up my Second Amendment rights, but I do want the FBI to get involved to say, should he purchase a weapon? The FBI immediately gets involved, and they can either choose to arrest him, or they can choose to bring a court proceeding against him at that point in time, or, and this is the reason why you may not want to just automatically take the gun purchase away, they may choose to follow him. It may be that they say, oh, we know he's associated with 4 other people. If we follow him to that house, then we can arrest them all. So it's a decision that has to be made in conjunction with the FBI, and I think that many have just sort of made this, you know, people who love gun control say, oh, this is an excuse now for gun control, but it really ought to be how do we stop terrorists?
But many in your party at this point seem to be open to this closing off, allowing anyone to purchase a gun on the watch list.
I think we're open to trying to figure out how we stop terrorists from having guns, and we just have different ideas on it. I guess for me, the Bill of Rights are really important and that they should be applied equally. So we've had times in our history when we didn't treat the Japanese fairly. We've had times when we didn't treat African Americans fairly. There could be a time when we don't treat Arab Americans fairly. So I think everybody deserves sort of the presumption of innocence. And so the terror list is a really, really big list, like maybe more than 1 million people. And the FBI will tell you that many people on there are not terrorists. So there needs to be a process. We need to be able to stop terrorists or potential terrorists from getting guns. It's just whether or not we're going to have what they call due process, where a person gets to defend themselves against an accusation. And a lot of us think the Constitution is important enough that we ought to make sure it's there for everyone.
Let's talk about some other issues. The Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton has promised a massive aid program for areas losing coal jobs. Republican Donald Trump has said he will bring coal jobs back, mining jobs back. Do you believe coal mining jobs would return in Kentucky if environmental regulations are loosened?
Yes. And I do think that we need to be clear what Hillary Clinton promised. She promised to put us out of business. She said we are going to continue to put coal miners and coal industry out of business. And then she said, oh, and then we'll get you some welfare after we put you out of business. The first thing we need to do is stop the regulations that are coming from President Obama, supported by Hillary Clinton, that are killing one of our industries. And I've traveled extensively throughout eastern Kentucky and western Kentucky, and there's a feeling of despair at all the jobs. There are some of our counties that have unemployment twice the national average. A lot of people out of work, and it's primarily because of President Obama and Hillary Clinton and their agenda, their war on coal. Will it all come back? I can't predict the future. Some of it is competition as well, but I can guarantee you that there are jobs that have been lost in Kentucky, thousands of jobs, because of President Obama's anti-coal war.
Your proposal, instead of, as you called it, a massive welfare program, but your proposal is something you've called economic freedom zones, and
right.
that changes the way taxes are done, right?
Yeah, Jack Kemp years ago talked about how can we help people who live in poverty. And this is, I think, a great idea, because what it does is it doesn't bring you a grant from Washington. It lowers the taxes so low that it leaves billions of dollars. So my plan would leave about $500 million in eastern Kentucky every year, which would be an enormous amount of money. $500 million left in eastern Kentucky. This would be a stimulus, but it wouldn't be a grant. What it would be is a lowering of taxes. I would lower the corporate tax to 5%, the personal income tax to 5%, and then for working class people that don't pay much income tax, I'd lower the payroll tax. But I'd do it for a long period of time. Eastern Kentucky is really struggling, and a $100,000 after-school basketball grant is not going to help Eastern Kentucky. We need something much more dramatic and much longer lasting, and I'm convinced it would help.
Would your goal in that case be to both ease a tax burden on existing businesses and attract others?
And it has to be both. That's another thing, because often states will say, oh, we'll give you an incentive. But it's hard to get new industry. So many people in eastern Kentucky will say, well, if we only had Toyota out here, because Toyota's been so great for Georgetown, but could we get Toyota to move out there? Well, maybe someday you get a big company to go, but in the meantime, while you're waiting for the big company to come, you need to lower the taxes to try to get your industry that is already in your community to grow more.
U.S. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky is our guest on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers. Our remaining minutes with him coming right up.